This video will just give you a couple examples to review how to do long division. We're going to first look at a relatively easy example of just dividing by 2. So our first example is 512 divided by 2. I also wrote it in the fraction form since that's a common way to see a division problem. So to get started, you want to take the number that you are dividing, in this case it's 512, and write it on the inside of that long division symbol. Then you take the number you're dividing by, in this example it's 2, and write it on the outside. When you go into long division, you're really thinking in terms of multiplication and looking at that number you're dividing section by section instead of all at once. So to get started, we want to look at 2 and look at that first digit of 512. So looking at 2 and 5. And thinking in terms of multiplication, you want to think, well, how many times can 2 go into 5? In our case, we have 2 times, right? Because 2 times 2 is 4. So we write the number of times it can go into that up at the top. So we're going to write 2, and then you subtract what 2 times 2 is, which is 4. That gives us 1. And before we look at how many times 2 can go into 1, we need to remember to bring that other digit down. And now we're looking at, well, how many times can 2 go into 11? Thinking in terms of multiplication, we know that 2 times 5 is 10, which is as close as we can get. So we write that 5 up at the top, and we subtract what 2 times 5 actually is, which is 10. And 11 minus 10 is then 1. Again, before we look at that, we must remember to bring down the other digit. And we have 2 and 12. So how many times can 2 go into 12? Well, that would be 6 times, because 2 times 6 is 12. And when we subtract 12, we get 0. Once we get 0 at the bottom and we have no more digits left to bring down, we know that we are finished. So my final answer to 512 divided by 2 would be this 256. Our next example is going to be a little bit different, and we'll see why once we set it up. So to set it up, we take the number we are dividing, 192, and write it inside of that symbol, the number we're dividing by, 8, and write it on the outside. So we always want to start by looking at the first digit, which here is 1. And we want to think, well, can 8 go into 1? And it can't. We had that it could in our last example, but in this one, we can't alone go into that first digit. So when this happens, you want to look at the first 2 together. And you want to think, well, can 8 go into 19? And if so, how many times? And it can, because 8 times 2 is 16. So rather than looking at just the first number, we want to look at both of them together. And we know that 8 times 2 is 16. So now we want to do 19 minus 16, which gives us 3. Bringing down the next digit gives us 32. And now I want to think, well, can 8 go into 32, and how many times? I know that 8 times 4 gives me 32 exactly. So I write my 4 up at the top. I subtract my 32. I get 0. When I go to bring another digit down, there are no more left. So again, at this point, I know I'm finished. And my final answer to 192 divided by 8 is 24. Lastly, let's look at when you're dividing by a 2-digit number instead of a single-digit number. So in this case, we're going to look at 156 divided by 12. 156 is going to go on the inside of that long division symbol, and 12, being the number I'm dividing by, still goes on the outside. When you're looking at 2-digit numbers, you want to look at how many times does that full 2-digit number go into the first 2 digits. We look at the first 2 digits because 12 can't go into just one by itself. So you need to look at 15 altogether. 12 goes into 15 one time, so I'm going to subtract 12 and get 3. bring down my 6. 12 goes into 36 perfectly 3 times. Subtract 36. I get 0. So I know I'm finished. So my final answer is going to be 13.